One of the major issues is the Ukrainian human rights story. And that's what we're here to talk about, is the Ukrainian human rights story. Allow me to share with you a brief quote of one of the Holodomor survivors. This is Ms. Maria Firman, which is available, by the way, on our website called holodomorsurvivors.ca, together with many other testimonials. I quote, "They told my father to take the bells down from the church. Father said, I didn't put them up and I won't take them down. So they beat him and took him to a holding cell. We didn't see him for more than 2 weeks. And then he came home and died right away. My sister died in bed by my side, but I didn't even know she was dead. My mother wanted to give her something to eat and called her, Ksenia, Ksenia. I said, she's sleeping. Mother went to her and she was already cold. Imagine what state of mind I was in. I didn't understand anything. Hunger kills. Who hasn't been hungry? May not understand, but hunger kills your memory. When wheat or rye was harvested, they used machines and left stalks in the field. So my mother, on her way home, collected stalks in order to cook something. A brigadier took away the stalks and beat my mother. My mother came home, laid down on the bed, and never got up again. I didn't know how long she lay there, but that's how she died. In a recent article, Dr. David Marples characterized current-day Ukraine as a society that never fully recovered from the Holodomor. He stated that present-day residents still have problems coming to terms with the crimes committed in 1932 and 33, because essentially this heartland of Ukraine was systematically denationalized and eradicated by the Soviet regime. It is this loss of memory and this denationalization which remains a significant problem for many Ukrainians, even its current president, Viktor Yanukovych. This is why Holodomor is one of the most important human rights stories that should be told. It also is an ideal lens through which to view the crimes of communism. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress supports the development of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. We believed in its mandate when it was first introduced to us in 2003 and continue to believe in its mandate. And its mandate, as you see here on the screen, is to explore the subject of human rights with special but not exclusive reference to Canada in order to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, to promote respect for others, and to encourage reflection and dialogue. One of the quotes on the museum website is, "The Canadian Human Rights Museum will be a wonderful contribution to Canada and human rights across the world." And we wholeheartedly support that mandate and that vision. And that is why we are here today, is to talk about how we can make that actual reality better. And we're here to be proactive and support. And that's what we've been doing since 2003. And I'll take you through a little bit of the history. There are 10 galleries, and all these titles that I'm going to tell you about are tentative. Number 1 is Introduction to Human Rights, which explores various approaches to the concept of human rights. Number 2 is the Indigenous Gallery, which looks at the indigenous approaches to human rights and human responsibilities. Number 3 is Canada's Human Rights Journey, traces various human rights struggles and victories in Canada's history. And that is one of the galleries we will turn back to. Number 4 is the Canadian Challenge, which looks at how Canadian legal traditions incorporate human rights. And in this particular gallery, we have suggested that there should be some inclusion about the legal challenges that we face under legislation as the War Measures Act. And those are some of the concrete recommendations that we're making to the museum. The next, 5th gallery, is examining the Holocaust. The 6th is Hope and Hard Work, which covers the growth of international human rights law and social movements since the Second World War. Number 7 is Breaking the Silence, which looks at how people have used human rights to respond and reconstruct the gross human rights violations so they cannot remain hidden. And this is where the Holodomor will be exhibited. And I'll return to this gallery. Number 8 is Canadians Making a Difference, which highlights specific stories where Canada or individual Canadians have made valuable contributions to human rights. Number 9 is Human Rights Today, which focuses on current human rights issues in Canada and globally. And number 10 it's Take Action, which challenges visitors to join the struggle to promote and protect human rights. So let's look specifically at the Ukrainian human rights stories. There's three major stories that we believe should be very prominently presented in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Number one is the World War I internment operations. Number two is the Holodomor. And number three is Soviet and Nazi oppression and persecution. Before I get into the details of what's there today and what are our concerns with it, I'd like to give you a brief history of the interaction between our community through the Ukrainian Canadian Congress and the Asper Foundation, and now today the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. In 2003, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress delegation and myself and some others here in the room, Lasha Shuluk and Ostap Pavelashka, were among some of the participants at those first meetings, met with Mr. Asper and talked about this vision and his vision. And we loved it. We thought it would be a great opportunity for us to have a world-class museum present serious human rights stories that have frankly been swept under the carpet, have been denied, have been questioned. The Asper Foundation made a commitment to us. Made a commitment to us in a letter written on April 11, 2003, almost 10 years ago to the day. And I just want to read to you the three major commitments that they've made. Number one, we wish to point out that our museum proposal acknowledges the Ukrainian famine genocide of 1932-33. We recognize and will include in the CMHR this famine genocide in which over 7 million people were starved to death. We further agree that this genocide will be featured very clearly, distinctly, and permanently in the CMHR. We will work with your organization to ensure that this is accomplished. You may wish to identify the appropriate historians and other resources to begin this process. Number two, we regret the omission in the Human Rights in Canada, a timeline of events, of the internment of Ukrainian Canadians during the First World War, and agree that it should be included. To this end, our proposal document has been revised to include this important part of Canadian history. Please be assured that it will be included as part of the Canadian Stories Gallery. A revised Volume 1 proposal will be sent to you next week. Again, your support of your organization in assisting us with this history would be appreciated. And number three, we recognize that the Ukrainian people were victims of the Nazis and will portray this fact. The intent of the museum is not to single out any one group, but portray the human costs when human rights were abused. As discussed, the museum will portray and focus on how people can make a difference. For example, of the 19,706 righteous among nations, as identified by Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial to the Holocaust, almost 10%, or 1,881, are of Ukrainian descent, the fourth largest of any country or ethnic origin. These were the commitments made by the Asper Foundation, and I truly and genuinely believe that that commitment was well-intentioned and should be upheld today. However, unfortunately, that commitment is not being upheld. The next part of the history which I want to discuss is moving into the legislation, which made it the first national museum outside of Ottawa, and a very unique type of museum because it was a private-public partnership where the private sector was going to raise half the money to construct it, and the public sector, meaning the federal government, was going to provide the other money. That was a pledge of about $130 million times two. So the other pledge was that the government would provide $22 million of annual operating funding. That equates to approximately an endowment of $500 million, a $500 million endowment, in order to continually, in perpetuity, fund this museum to the tune of about $22 million a year for its operations. A board of trustees was appointed. The board of trustees was essentially the group which was the friends of the museum. Over time, that board has evolved and has changed. But we see a lot of the things that were initially developed were set in stone some years ago before the real changeover in the board started to happen. There was a Content Advisory Committee report. The Content Advisory Committee set out across Canada and had several thousand interviews, consultations. Among those, our community participated in 85 of those, where we had one position, which was very clear and has been consistent and has not changed. We have participated in the process. We've made representations on the issues that I've outlined. And in the Content Advisory Committee, there has been no mention of the crimes of communism. And that, quite frankly, is an abomination. The Holodomor was mentioned in one instance, but it was put into the context of some groups are complaining that their tragedies are not included, such as the Holodomor. It was not a discussion about how the Holodomor should be included. It was really a discussion about why it should not be included. I believe that the museum management, the board of directors, and the government of Canada should outrightly reject this discredited Content Advisory Committee, and they should stop consulting it. Another document in 2012 was released, and that is the gallery's profile. And that, together with the schematic, is the basis upon which we're talking about the museum. And now we're talking about the museum with actual description and actual diagrams and an actual tour. So what I'm telling you is what we're seeing concretely and what we're not happy with. But very recently, in an attempt to be proactive, in an attempt to try in a good faith manner, trying to help the museum understand, the museum board and their development team understand the significance of the Ukrainian human rights stories, again, the First World War internment operations, the Holodomor, and how Ukraine suffered under the Nazis and the Soviets. We are proactively, through an advisory committee, which is chaired by Dr. Yuri Derevich and has all the leading experts on those three areas, to provide in a proactive manner information and content to the museum. And that is moving forward, although on a very slow pace. And quite frankly, it's another way to continue to process us. About a month and a half ago, myself and several members, leadership of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, including the Provincial Council President, Alexander Budarchuk, toured the museum, and as a result, we issued a statement on that to the museum board. We, in a good faith manner, didn't take it public. We wanted to first have an opportunity for the board to see it. The board met about 3 weeks ago. They had an opportunity to see our concerns, and to this day, we have not heard a response from the board as to our concerns that we saw in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So let's talk about the two major issues, and that being the internment and the Holodomor. And the Canada's Journey Gallery, which tells the story about Canadian human rights issues, there is no story niche devoted to the internment. The story niches, and I'll just quickly read them to put it into context of what is there in the story niches, are the cultural disposition in the North, disability rights, queer resistance, Japanese-Canadian forced relocation, the Winnipeg general strike, Chinese head tax, the right to vote, women's rights, gatekeeping, the plight of refugees, Métis rights, migrant workers, stolen sisters, same-sex marriage, language, culture, and identity, and religious oppression. But there is no exhibit on the internment. What will be in that exhibit will be a digital picture. On the second story of the wall of the museum, there will be a digital picture of presumably men behind barbed wire fences. And quite frankly, if that's the way that Canadians and Canadian school children are going to learn about the internment, there's really nothing to be learned with a picture on a wall. And quite frankly, the First World War internment operation set the precedent for the Chinese head tax, the Japanese internment, and many other human rights issues in Canada, and frankly should be prominently displayed, as was committed to us numerous times. So we need to have an exhibit space that actually tells a story that we can teach Canadians about this important story to our community and to all Canadians. Moving to the Holodomor. There are two places in the museum where the Holodomor will be mentioned. The first place is in the Holocaust Gallery. In the Holocaust Gallery, there will be a Lemkin exhibit. So the Holodomor will be featured there, although in the way that it's described on this panel, that the Holocaust will be the primary description with the others that will fall behind that one. But the Holodomor will be mentioned there. The second place will be a small gallery, which is actually behind the Hope and Hard Work Gallery. That will have a panel, one of 5 panels there, to the Holodomor. The 5 panels will be those 5 genocides that are recognized by the Government of Canada in legislation. And those are the Holocaust, Armenia, Rwanda, Srebrenica, and the Holodomor. So the Holodomor will have a panel in the museum. Some of others try to sensationalize this about who's got more square footage. Nobody's walking around with a measuring tape. But when you look at an atrocity, a human rights tragedy that has a very important story to tell, to teach Canadians a different part of human history and its impact, the Holodomor, the amount of space that's being allocated is frankly inappropriate. The typical visitor time that they anticipate is somewhere between 2 to 3 hours. So a visitor will visit the museum approximately between 2 to 3 hours. So that works out to about 20 minutes per gallery. Well, if you look at then the gallery called Breaking the Silence, where there'll be a panel 1 of 5 devoted to the Holodomor, the math is pretty simple. Basically, there's 4 minutes allocated to the Holodomor. Out of 180 minutes of viewing time, 4 of those minutes will be dedicated to the Holodomor. If we're going to teach a very important human rights history story, you can't do that in 4 minutes. And when you talk about the Holodomor and its value, there are many, many important angles. First of all, the Holodomor is an ideal lens through which to view the crimes of communism. And our friends in the Central and Eastern European communities have spoken out in that regard, that they support the Holodomor having a permanent and prominent gallery in the museum through which they can also view their tragedies, their histories, whether it's Katyn, whether it's the Czech Republic in '69, whether it's the oppression in the Balts. These are an opportunity for Canada to tell a very important human rights story through the lens of the Holodomor. Secondly, today we look at the world and food continues to be used as a weapon to oppress people. We see that in places like Somalia and Ethiopia. And wouldn't the Human Rights Museum be the ideal spot to teach Canadians about this through the lens of the Holodomor, how food was used as a weapon to destroy and oppress a peoples? And to teach Canadians that they can't stand by while that same tragedy is happening in places like Somalia and Ethiopia. The case for why the Holodomor has to have a prominent and permanent gallery is overwhelming. And we continue to make that case, and we continue to be processed, and now we're getting to a point where we're afraid that all the exhibits are being built. So when is it going to be too late? Where they say, sorry guys, it's already done. And when you ask the question of who's making the decision, how is it being determined? Is it the management? Is it the advisors? Is it the board? Is it the government? You don't get a clear answer. The clear answer is that, first of all, the government is not making the decision because the government appoints the board of trustees, and it's an arm's length Crown corporation, which their board of directors has to be arm's length, and they are responsible for building the museum. I think that as our elected representatives, you should help us make a say to ensure that this museum is built right. And that's what we're asking for. They need to put the pressure on the museum to ensure that this museum truly reflects human rights stories that are important to Canadians. The last story I want to talk about is Soviet Nazi oppression and persecution. Again, there is not one mention in the museum, there's been not one mention in the Content Advisory Committee report about the crimes of communism or Soviet and Nazi oppression and persecution. And that is, quite frankly, a travesty. So what I want to conclude with is that we want this National Museum to succeed. But in order for it to succeed, it has to be properly represented. We are in this together. When I mean we are in this together, meaning that all of us in this room, all the Ukrainian Canadians throughout the country, our Eastern European friends are in this together. You cannot sit back and expect that the Ukrainian Canadian Congress is going to do it all. You have to take up this initiative yourselves, pick up your pens, pick up your phones, and write and call and be vocal about this. Educate others around you. Educate your friends, your colleagues about what these issues are. Unfortunately, this is being sensationalized and being pitted as one group against the other, which is an absolute absurdity, and it's absolutely false. We have no issue with any other group that has any galleries or displays in the museum. That's never been an issue, and unfortunately it's been twisted to make it sound and pit one community against the other, which is absolutely untrue and is absolutely false. And we should stand up against that. What we're asking for, as I presented, the Holodomor, the internment, and the oppression of our peoples by the Nazis and the Soviets need to be properly represented in this museum. And we need to do it together. So what we want, keep the promise that was made to us 10 years ago, and why we've been very supportive of this museum. Number two, we're calling on balance and fairness, and we're not seeing that. When you look at the Holodomor being allocated the equivalent of 4 minutes of viewing time in the museum, that is not fair and that is not balanced. And finally, we need to call to action. As I mentioned, the museum exhibits are being built, the content is being developed, And if we don't change things now and change the course of this ship, then I'm sorry, it's going to be an abomination that, frankly, this community here, this Ukrainian-Canadian community, is going to have to listen to for decades and decades and decades. When your friends come to the museum and see it, what are they going to do? They're going to call you and they're going to say, how could you let this happen? In Winnipeg, in Manitoba. Manitoba has the highest proportional population of Ukrainians anywhere in Canada. You have an obligation to work with us and help us in shifting the course of this ship. And that's what I'm calling on you to do today. So on that I'll conclude, and I'll look forward to your questions.